Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISAR.com.
Thank you for downloading another episode from the Unconventional Soldier podcast, which aims to record the history of the British Army's STA Patrols Unit through the voices of the veterans who served in its ranks. Tonight I'm talking to David Jones, who will cover the troop commander's perspective of the unit, including how the troops in 3, 2 and 5 Regiment were organised and tasked, the pressures to get more volunteers through selection, the widening of recruitment and the attachment of SAS Captains to the troop. We'll finish off how two separate troops were brought together to form firstly 7-3 Sphinx Special OP Battery and finally 473 Battery. And at the end of the podcast we'll do the usual with Desert Island Dits and we'll cover David's choice of book, film and luxury item. But before we start, I'd just like to say this is our 6th podcast and we're averaging about 500 downloads per episode, which is great, but we would like to break out to an even wider audience. And the best way to achieve this is by building a profile on iTunes through the reviews on that website. We currently have 14 on that platform, but 30% of our downloads are from Apple devices. So we could do with a few more, and we have the potential for around 150. So if you're enjoying the series, we'd really appreciate a review, hopefully a 5-star one, and that will help increase our audience engagement. So as normal, we'll start off with our guest military biography leading up to when they joined the unit. So David, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
I decided to join the Army in 1981 while on a year's experience as part of my industrial chemistry degree. I was lucky enough to be assigned to do research at the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham, and I lived in the officers' mess as a long-haired civvy. I quickly realised chemistry was boring, and the officers doing the in-service degrees all seemed to have an exciting life in the Army. It may have helped that as a skydiver at the time, I was told that if I could get Army sponsorship for my final university year, that I would go on to Florida, adventure training as part of the British team in the World Collegiate Championships. Luckily, I did so, and I was commissioned in September 81 and had a month's free skydiving that Christmas. I joined the Royal Artillery as one day I wanted to get to 148 Battery, and because it was more technical than the other choices. My first regiment was 29 Commando, 79 Battery as gun position officer, followed by 148 Battery, and then Special OPs as troop commander of 5 Regiments Troop. The only op tour was Cyprus as BC-79 in 95. Subsequently, however, I did 10 months in Kandahar in 09 as a Canadian. Just to explain that, I went to Canada in 97 from Commando Battery Command, 289 actually, as an exchange instructor in gunnery. Managed a second exchange tour and stayed, joining the Canadian Artillery in 2003, and I've been in ever since. I was posted to the troop, I assume, to bring my small patrol experience from 148.
So, David, what was the connection to 148? When you opened up there, you said that 148 was where you wanted to go. What sort of put you onto 148 as a unit that you wanted to head to?
I think I'd seen some artillery promotional material that had a naval gunfire guy doing all this exciting stuff, and I thought, that's what I want.
And that sort of inspired you to...
Yep.
Okay, then. So I think most of our listeners will know that the Commando course is pretty demanding. Could you just give us an overview of what it was like, sort of including the physical tests, and also just cover a little bit about the selection procedure to get into 148?
Yeah, sure. The 30-miler is, of course, the signature test for the Commando course. But I did the course just after the Royal Artillery Young Officers course, as 29 Commando was my first posting. It involved an intense beat-up in Plymouth and then the course itself in Lympstone with the Royal Marines. It included tactical operations on exercise, with speed marches included, usually to and from the exercise, as well as standalone physical tests. After Sandhurst and the Young Officers course, it seemed at times like more of the same, as we were also critiqued on our infantry tactics too. The course was hard, naturally, but I was pretty fit in those days, and equalled the record for the Tarzan assault course. The next time we did it, it was the test, and they gave me a colour sergeant to beast me round to try to beat the record. But the cumulative effects of the days in between meant I was actually slower, so no record for me. After a couple of years in 79 and on promotion to captain, I requested to go to 148, where, as I say, I'd always wanted to go. I'd been up to Hereford for the SAS Officer Acquaint Week, but before the minimum time one had to serve before attempting selection. I told them my aim was to go to 148 until I had that minimum time in and then do selection, and I think that helped me get to the battery. However, I suffered a detached retina resulting from a brick in the face at Sandhurst during the Northern Ireland training phase, which was only picked up during the diving medical at 148, as I was slated to be the diving officer. That put paid to both military diving and SAS selection for me. To get into 148 at that time, one had to complete the Commando course, naturally, and then additionally para-selection, known as P Company, just as an extra physical step. I had to wait for a year after joining 148 for my repaired retina to be up to attending, although in the meantime I did the various courses such as Forward Observer and Forward Air Controller. In fact, I was already parachute qualified from 7-9 battery, but as you can imagine, being an officer wearing a green beret on parachute selection run by the Parachute Regiment meant I had a great deal of extra attention during it. Understatement. I only wore my wings once I knew I'd passed, of course. The next CO to Command 29 Commando, Graham Kerr, removed the requirement for P Company, saying why would he let the paras essentially decide who went to one of his batteries? Now, every naval gunfire team was commanded by a captain, but had a Royal Naval signaller as a more specialist. Everyone in 148 up to that time had to complete P Company after the Commando course, including these signallers who stepped off a ship and got on with it. And even the chefs too. Massive respect to those guys. Interestingly, one joined the SAS and later served as an advisor to 473 battery.
Yeah, it's a very small world. Was there much of a kickback to the whole the colonel getting rid of P Company as part of the selection course? Did it cause much of a furore?
Yes, and even today, in the battery Facebook group, there's a lot of discussion about those days were hard, those days were good. Yes, people felt that it was a retrograde step, but maybe he had a point. He also had enormous credibility because he was a very long-serving SAS officer, so he came with understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to one of the lads from 29 who was in the battery, and he said that if I'm right, he was known as Stretch.
That's correct.
Because he's always pushing the regiment that extra bit further.
Oh yes.
Yeah, so he was well known for pushing people. So it's interesting you mentioned 148 because not only did 148 influence me as well, because prior to me joining the army in 85, I read a book called Faultless Commando by Hugh McManus, who was an officer in 148, and that book is about 148's operational tour down in the Falklands War. And in the late 80s, he also wrote a book called The Scars of War, which is probably about the first book I ever read on PTSD. And because back in the late 80s, early 80s, nobody ever knew much about PTSD at all. And it was very much a case on if you endured something bad in operations, you're just expected to crack on. So was he there in the battery at the time you were there, David?
No, he'd left when I joined, but most of his party remained in the battery for some time, so I knew those guys quite well.
Yeah, and 148 had a good war and were hugely influential, and I think that was the war that saved them as a unit, because just prior to that, I think they're talking about disbanding them, weren't they?
You're absolutely right. I think it was John Knott, who was then the defence minister, had decided to get rid of guns on ships because nobody would ever need them.
Yeah, politicians getting it wrong again. The same mistake they're probably making with main battle tanks in the British Army at the minute, talking about getting rid of them as well. So I worked with the Canadian infantry in Bosnia, and I was always impressed by the professionalism. And I know lads that worked with them in Afghanistan have said the same thing. So from your experiences in both, what would you say were the main differences between the British and Canadian armies?
Actually, they're quite similar in many ways, which I'll be honest makes going from one to the other quite easy. But especially with our shared history and very similar organisation, we're really quite similar. But without being too critical of the British Army, I would say that the Canadian Forces looks after its members in a very much better manner. And although I left the British Army and joined the Canadians in 2003, that comment is based upon 4 years in the UK on it with the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps headquarters in Gloucester, which was a British-led organisation. And I just felt that the people weren't given enough support or consideration in some of the decisions that were made in careers and with regard to family life.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you see that all the time, the way the Americans look after it, the way the Canadians look after their people as well. I think too often now, I've been out of the army 13 years now, and looking in on it, you can see that it's very staid, it's very traditional, though it likes to think of itself as forward thinking, and I just think it promises a lot but rarely delivers. And there's a lot of people fall through the cracks that could do with being looked after a bit better. Kev can't be with us tonight, unfortunately, but he was saying to me that a few years ago he linked up with the Canadian Peace Support Training when he worked with MOD. And this was about looking to the preparation of civilians going to operational and hostile environments. So it was a great experience for Kev. And he also had one of their senior instructors come over and put him, and that instructor from Canada went through the British training. So he's seen quite a semi-operational side from the civilians. He's seen the military side. But just sort of going back to 473, does the Canadian Army have anything like 473 battery?
Well, talking of the PSTC course for civilians, my wife had to complete that course. It's called the High Threat Environment, or HET course, in order to come and live here in Beirut. It was very challenging and realistic, but she thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, with regards to 473, funnily enough, a proposal was made by someone who'd come across the battery about 10 years ago to form a similar organization in the Royal Canadian Artillery to mirror the capabilities. But we only have 3 field regiments and 1 general support regiment. So it was pretty clear to me, with my special OP troop selection experience, that it would be frankly impossible to man, even if recruiting across the Canadian forces and being able to keep any selection standards. There would also be great competition for volunteers with the Canadian Special Operations Regiment and JTF2, the Tier 1 soft guys. The idea did not progress, which I believe was correct.
Yeah, and I think increasingly that's going to be a problem the British Army is going to face with its shrinking mass, because we're around about 78,000 now. And you think how many people attempt SAS selection and commando courses and para courses. I was talking to somebody the other day there, and they're saying a lot of the batteries in the commando and para brigades now, they are not even commando and para trained. They only have 1 or 2 now. So I think that might even reflect this problem you have with a shrinking army.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right.
When you arrived in Germany, can you outline how the troops were set up at the time and how they're deployed? As each troop was part of a different depth fire regiment and under different command instructions. So was there a common deployment procedure? And how did the troops maintain their interoperability, or did they even manage to do that at all?
The troops had moved from Hildesheim and essentially split into 1 in 3-2 regiment and 1 in 5 regiment, both in Dortmund, in neighbouring barracks, actually. The troop in 5 conducted the selection for both troops, which I commanded. But having both troops under different command structures was obviously not good for interoperability, as after selection, they trained as each troop felt was appropriate. Also, there was huge duplication of effort, as, for example, specialist recognition of hundreds of Soviet vehicles was being taught in both barracks rather than together. The deployment areas up north were similar for both troops, so it was not like there was even a different requirement for each troop's operations. Ultimately, Commander General Support at 1st Artillery Brigade, a colonel, commanded both 3-2 and 5 regiments, and that was the first common command level, which was just way too high. Both troops had sea containers located forward at 5 Regiment's old base in Hildesheim, which was then an Army Air Corps helicopter base. Each patrol kept its digging tools there, the small digger, a drill and a jackhammer, plus fuel and rations, as well as the Mexi shelter itself. And the idea for both troops was to drive there and then deploy to the assigned patrol positions, as Sammy explained in his podcast.
So do you reckon this sort of default position was achieved due to the rush to get the troops up and running? Was it a lack of joined-up thinking at a higher level, or was it down to just rivalry between the 2 regiments and the 2 troops on the ground?
Certainly there was rivalry between the regiments. There's no question about that, although the rank and file of the troops got on very well because they'd gone through 19 weeks of selection and training together, and that created great bonds between the guys who ultimately ended up in different troops. And I think that carried on throughout the rank structure as people got more senior. You would know a lot more about that than I would. But it was just not very good.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think the more you reflect on it, and as we're doing these podcasts, there's just some aspects of what we're doing. You realise now, looking back on it, as you're a bit older, a bit more cynical and less naive, that a lot of it wouldn't have survived contact with the enemy, even just to the extent of digging in and getting away with that initial deployment. I don't think there was any sort of deception plan included at a higher level. It was all been done on chance and a bit of potluck is how I see it. Would you think that's a fair thing to say?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I don't recall any kind of deception or plan to protect the guys, and clearly digging in with all the mechanics that the other guys have gone through in the different podcasts was a massive undertaking that could easily be seen by maybe people out walking their dogs or whatever. But while hope is not a method, we had a lot of hope in those days.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and part of that has always been a downfall of the British Army. I think you've seen that in Afghanistan. You've seen it in Iraq in recent years, where get in there, crack on, and get the job done. And sometimes a bit of pause for thought about what you're actually taking on would have been quite useful. And I agree with what you're saying about the rivalry between the two troops. It was always healthy, and the relationships are always spot on. And I think even that right up to troop commander level. And I know that when we did become a battery, most people were looking forward to it. So it's interesting you're talking about 148, the Commando Brigade, the Para Brigade, and all those units have a selection process. And any unit that does have a selection process is always going to be undermanned. So did you ever come under any pressures to ensure that the patrols were fully manned?
I certainly did. I'll have to explain the background. For security reasons, the troops' existence and role were not advertised. So as a result, they suffered from a lack of awareness in the wider artillery, which at the time was the only source of volunteers. And this therefore meant a lower number of soldiers attending selection. Of course, that then lowers the number of people who are inevitably going to pass. On the other hand, everybody knew what the commandos and paras did because they advertised heavily, and there's no doubt they took many possible troop members away as a result.
So do you reckon that the lack of a maroon or a green berets or award for doing a course, and obviously the kudos that goes with that, was a problem? I mean, it took a lot of effort to get into the troop, but there was no real reward to show for it. You got the badge, but that was very low key. But also on the flip side, to be honest, that sort of little known aspect of the troop and the sort of the nicheness of it did attract some people. But just going back to my original question, do you think that lack of maroon or green beret type thing did hold us back?
Yes, there's no doubt. The lack of official recognition at that time did count against our recruiting ability for sure. But the fact it was in Germany did appeal to some people. And in fact, we managed to recruit a number of great long-serving Special OP members from both the Para and Commando Artillery regiments. And the badge, as you mentioned, it was approved by the Army Dress Committee during my time as OC. And yes, the dot is in the middle. That's just a message for some current debate. I also campaigned very hard for higher pay. I think it was Band 3, as I recall, but I don't remember if it came in before I left, because the guys certainly deserved it. In 5 Regiment, the guys were authorized to wear floppy peaked hats instead of berets, and also did not do any duties. Now, that's only very small recognition.
Yeah, I mean, it's but Band 3 came in for junior NCO, full screws, corporals, bombardiers, and Band 6 pay also came in for sergeant patrol commanders. So in the end, the pay did come in. I think most people were happy with some paracord and some smocks as well, mind, but even smaller reward. So how did you open up recruiting to other units? And can you also cover the initiative to recruit soldiers directly from training units such as junior leaders? Yes. And bearing in mind that previous joining requirements stated that volunteers should have been in the Army for at least 2 years before attending selection.
Correct, yes. The Royal Artillery, in an attempt to improve the numbers on selection, which would potentially result in more passes, of course, came up with a plan to send soldiers from the junior leaders regiment straight to selection. I think pass rates for the whole of selection and the 19-week course at the time were around 14%. However, this experiment with young soldiers under 18 had predictable results, as nearly all of the 15 or so quickly dropped out, simply due to not having either the experience in the field or especially the mental maturity to cope with such an arduous selection and course. There were a few notable exceptions, though, and they went on to become outstanding members of the troops and Royal Artillery. Gunner Miles Amos was one of those who made it, and he had a very bright future, but he was sadly killed by an IED in Northern Ireland, where he deployed on secondment from 5 Regiment with you guys in 3-2 OP Troop.
Yeah, and we'll cover Northern Ireland in a couple of podcasts with Neil Hogg, and we'll cover that contact as well, in which not only was Miles Amos killed, but also Steve Cummins from 3-2's troop.
Of course, yeah.
I didn't envy those young lads turning up. I mean, the average age in the troop at the time was probably mid to late 20s onwards. Yeah. And this idea was heavily opposed. So not only did those young soldiers have the hill to climb of selection, they were also not very welcome in the troop lines by the experienced members of the troop. So for the guys that did get through, they did absolutely amazingly well, and hats off to them.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note that of those 4, obviously one was killed in action in Northern Ireland. One made Warrant Officer 2, another made WO1, Warrant Officer Class 1, and the final one also made WO1 and then onwards to a late entry commission. So you're right, those guys were quality blokes. But it's also a hallmark of the troop standard that it produced a huge number of WO2s and WO1s, way out of proportion for a small unit, and many of them also went on to commission. So I think, again, that selection process did mark them out. And I think for me, and you'll know this from your time in 148, and I'm not disparaging to any other soldiers listening, but you can get a fit soldier and you can get an intelligent soldier. But to get a fit and intelligent soldier can often be an uphill battle. And I think that's what units like 148 and OP Troop were looking for. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, the technical challenges of getting through that 19 weeks of really detailed technical training. You went through it. I only did selection. Very, very demanding.
So how did the artillery look to improve the pass rate then at this point?
Well, the way that most people look at it is to examine the selection itself. So they initiated a detailed event-by-event study of selection, which, of course, I felt personally responsible for, and the training, which, after its publication, resulted in much pressure on me to make selection easier. Now, nobody really said it has to be easier, but what they said was the same thing. We have to have a higher pass rate. So we did remove some events that they felt were simply arduous without product. The however long 6-8 hours in the back of a Bedford after being bugged out was one of those that got taken out. It was actually, I think, sleep deprivation, but it wasn't sold as such. And although those events were removed, the standard of soldier graduating from the whole course and joining a troop did not lower afterwards.
Yeah, we've had long discussions in bars, and I'm no doubt these discussions go on nowadays as well. And we mentioned previously that on the initial courses, it was select out rather than train in, and a lot of good candidates fell by the wayside. But I also think that was generally a hallmark of the army of that time as well. You look at basic training. When I was in basic training at Woolwich, you're not talking parachute or infantry training, parachute regiment or infantry training here. Guys just fell by the wayside, and there was huge amounts of wastage back then. But I also think at that time, people were queuing up to join the army, especially post-Falklands, so the army could have its pick of who it wanted, and it had to change it without a doubt. So most of, with a little extra training encouragement, would have made the grade in the patrols, and that's obviously why the selection was changed in order to give people a bit extra training and encouragement to get through. So what did you do throughout the Royal Artillery to raise awareness of the troop and increase volunteers?
To raise awareness and ultimately numbers attending selection, we conducted a recruiting tour, probably late 88, of all gunner regiments in Germany and the UK. The CO5 regiment would make an introduction. I then gave a presentation on the troops' selection, training, and role. And a few of the guys critically ran a static display and could interact with soldiers themselves afterwards. And we would address the whole regiment. What we found were many soldiers who'd been denied applying, despite artillery regulations stating that such applications for specialist selections, including special OPs, could not be blocked by the chain of command. At the same time, we opened up selection and service in special OPs to other units of the army outside the Royal Artillery, which did result in some exceptional non-gunners joining. And you know those guys. However, we also had some disasters, utter disasters, as some volunteers saw joining the troops as a way to avoid being sent back to UK with their battalions on the then regular rotation of units to and from Germany. Needless to say, those people did not have the motivation to succeed.
Yeah, and I remember those guys got found out quite quickly, but I suppose maybe perversely, more guys going back might have put more pressure on you to do something about selection, because people just see 20 guys turning up. 10 of them might not have been there for the right reasons, but then leave. But did that also have an effect on how it was perceived about the course?
No, because some of these guys ended up in front of the CO on CO's orders, and so they weren't failures because the team had deemed them unsuitable. They actually committed things that meant they were sent back to their units with disciplinary issues as well. And it was those sort of people that you just didn't want.
Right, got you. I mean, the OP troop in 473 battery's always been ever adapting to the climate as things change. So when the wall came down, we found new roles. When the lads went to Bosnia, they adapted. Later on in the 2000s in Iraq and Afghanistan, they adapted again. So it's very much an evolving unit who's able to adapt very, very quickly. But did the lack of numbers, from your perspective, ever put the existence of the Special OP Troop in question back then?
No, quite simply never. And I think the reason for this was that the senior officers on the exercises had seen what they brought to the operational and tactical table. And there was no way that they were going to lose those eyes out front. No way.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's keeping the right people on side. And as we became more mature, I think getting officers further up the chain of command also to fight a corner probably helped as well. So I remember back in Germany, late 80s, we had regular attachments of late entry commissioned officers from 228 SAS Regiment. Why was that?
Well, as already covered in previous podcasts, the troops had specialist NCOs from the Paras and SAS attached as embedded instructors and advisors. I think this exposure gave Director Special Forces an idea for a solution to the difficult task of appropriately employing an SAS regimental sergeant major as an officer when he was commissioned. So we each, both troops that is, received a commissioned RSM for a year who would wear uniform and act as if they were Royal Artillery captains, so they could cut their teeth as officers and then go back to 22 SAS after an appropriate gap and with credibility as officers. Naturally, they were immense resources for the troops, especially for me, with additional selection input and mentoring.
Yeah, I remember those guys. It was an amazing opportunity for us as young soldiers to have these hugely experienced SF operators with impressive operational records to assist in training. But how did they find life in a very traditional environment like the British Army of the Rhine, and again, a gunner regiment?
I think it was very much a culture shock. But, and we had a number of interesting occurrences because, of course, they had to conform as a good, outwardly looking artillery captain. They had to conform to the rigid rules of Germany soldiering, and this was often alien to them. For example, one SAS captain who decided, without telling anybody, he'd just pop up to Berlin, which was still in the East at that time, on a visit, but did none of the necessary, a lot of application paperwork. And that resulted in him being arrested at the border, which was a little bit of an admin issue.
Yeah, that sounds like some of the guys that came across. I mean, I remember going to exercise in some nervous moments for patrol commanders as their deployment orders were assessed by a long-standing SAS veteran with a gaze and inquisition that would cut through them like a laser. And often I was quite happy just to be a bod carrying the radio Bergen. But they also added some valuable insights. I mean, we're in the bar one night talking and, as usual, moaning about the rigid dress standards that were a pain in the backside. And this was often made worse by the fact that the troop was often the focus of the RSM, who had objected to our, shall we say, casual approach to uniform, hair, and sideburn length. So we're always, getting the wrath of the RSM. But I was talking to one of the SAS officers, and he made the observation that we were a covert unit and shouldn't draw attention to ourselves on training, ops, or even in camp. And he made the point about what would we gain from pissing off people and giving them the ammo to make your life difficult? And a lot of what he was saying made sense. And he said that when he'd been in ops in places like Borneo and Malaya, they used to tidy themselves up. And they'd stand off from a village when they're doing a bit of hearts and minds. They'd sort their ripped uniforms and they'd go in looking a bit in order rather than just emerging from the jungle with a kit hanging off them. And I took that away with me later years. When we were attached to different units in Bosnia, Canadian as well as British. And that was one of my things. I'd say to the guys, we should be able to drive in and out of these compounds and nobody should know who we are. You know what I mean? We should be like ghosts. And by doing that, you just blend in with your surroundings. So yeah, that was a good lesson for me. So prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a project to modernize the stay-behind-Mexi-hide concept. I do remember little things like the development of a power management system and more advanced camera systems. Can you tell us a little bit about that, David?
Yeah, living in a Mexi underground, as you well know, for weeks was not just extremely unpleasant, as Sammy outlined in his podcast. It was also very dangerous due to the highly ad hoc nature of the systems employed to support life. The air supply, for example, was pumped in by no less than a Land Rover heater blower motor powered by a car battery. Talk about Heath Robinson. And I I don't believe there were even CO or CO2 monitors. The vision devices at the observation post were primitive, but they were sort of current at that time. And the acoustic warning system was truly, as again mentioned by Sammy, a rubber pair of human ears that was strapped either side of a tree.
They were actually quite good, David. They were actually
I know. They looked like a trophy though when you were holding them. But none of the power for these systems was managed inside the hide holistically. And remember, this was supposed to last for 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think we didn't cover this previously, but the Mexi site was also very difficult to manage externally to avoid too much sign, and often you'd have several antennas set up, which would be a giveaway if people got too close. It was made a little bit easier when we got the upgraded radio, the PRC 319, and that gave us the ability to remote antennas away from the Mexi up to 50 meters. I think it was 50 meters. And in addition, if an OP was compromised, all the enemy had to do was pick up the landline and follow it all the way back to the Mexi. So it'd been very, very easy to compromise the Mexi itself. There was always talk that we would get Claymore anti-personnel mines for positional defence, but in true troop fashion, we also practiced making improvised Claymores out of plastic explosive with nuts and bolts stuffed into large food tins we scrounged from the cookhouse. So finally, not only was it dark and smelly in Mexi, but it got incredibly hot and humid due to confined space and lack of circulating air, as you pointed out, David. And we often stagged on in T-shirts because you had little to no chance of getting out of a hatch if you bumped with your belt kit and a very long SLR in your hand. And it didn't matter anyway, because a couple of grenades dropped inside would have ended things quite swiftly. So I also know that the SAS territorial units used the Mexi as well, David. Do you just want to cover a little bit about that?
Yeah, this actually had a great spin-off benefit for the troops because I think it was around 88. They used the Mexi concept as well. And in their case, assuming that they would have got there from the UK in time, that they would observe and conduct direct action. And they were looking for specific signature equipments rather than doing fire support, which was the troops' role, of course. So Director Special Forces initiated, and of course they had a large budget, a large project to make Mexi life safer and far more efficient and capable, called Project Ephesus. It did produce power management systems and foul air monitors, as well as tiny microphones instead of the ears during my time. I also had the pleasure of flying back to the UK for the monthly meetings at Special Forces HQ in London, which was a great bonus for a young captain. Of course, when the Berlin Wall came down, as you well know, Fergie, in 89, it put paid to the Mexi concept, and naturally, Project Ephesus ended too.
I'd be interested to know, as I said, back in those days, I was a young Lance bombardier, and did you think the whole Mexi concept would have worked? I mean, we've sort of touched on it earlier and we've touched on the podcast, but was it just a death mission, or do you think it would have been pulled off?
No, I think it would have worked because there was a lot of careful planning going into the sites, reverse engineering the Soviet artillery, as has been explained in podcasts before, so that you'd have an OP forward, either one or two, looking at what were quite strongly believed to be likely deployment sites for big targets. Now, how long the guys would have survived is another question, because, of course, there would have been echelon upon echelon of Soviets going over. And it was, as you well know, a very fragile mission. And hence all the banter about the teddy bear with the noose regarding the exfiltration or not.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was a great role. When you're 22 years old or 23 years old, that's all you care about.
Yeah.
So on Sammy's podcast, we discuss visitors, often high-ranking officers coming to visit Mexis and the OPs on exercise. What did they think of the role, and what was their reaction to visiting a Mexi that had been operational for a couple of weeks?
Yeah, they were always very big fans of what the capability brought them tactically and operationally. And they were always impressed by the quality of guys they met. And you talk about the Mexi, and the frankly awful conditions they cheerfully endured to operate. Sammy's description of not giving anyone any clues about Mexi locations still gives me the shivers, because leading visiting generals to a Mexi and hoping I could actually find it, something that was designed not to be found, was very difficult, including once at night. Luckily, somehow I exceeded each time with a bit of luck. But I do remember one visitor, no names, but he was a very senior artillery general at the time, who naturally wanted to go inside the Mexi for a proper look once we'd actually found it. As he started going down the ladder, I suddenly thought he would not fit because he was so fat, which would have been really, really embarrassing, because the hatch was quite small, as you remember. He managed to cram himself in, and he squeezed himself out again, but it was a tight fit.
Yeah, I remember even just changing round the OPs, which actually Sammy alluded to, didn't happen that often, but could be an absolute nightmare to get back and try and locate the OP hatch at night. And your worst nightmare would be you'd start one of these exercises, and as a sprog of the patrol, the first point of call for you was the OP. And if it was a very busy exercise and you'd a lot of troops passing overhead, you could end up spending the majority of the exercise in the OP, which was exceedingly uncomfortable. I don't think we touched on the dimensions, but most OPs that are dug in underground, David, as you know, are probably about 6 foot long and about 4 or 5 foot deep. Tiny for people. So a very tight fit as well for that. So with the two troops operating the way you described earlier, it's obvious that this wouldn't deliver an economy of scale or was even practical. How did the initiative to move two troops into a fully fledged battery come about?
Well, as I said, I came to Special OPs from 148 Battery, which was based in Poole with the Special Boat Service, who we directly supported and deployed with. It was miles away from Regimental HQ in Plymouth. Now, it's a bit of an understatement, but let's just say it was not always easy for the Special OP troops, being very different, to be based inside a depth fire regiment's headquarters battery. And I could see how the OP troops being based away could work just as well as 148. More important was the fact that the troops' deployment areas were near Hildesheim, and that was where the patrol equipment was stored, as we've discussed, necessitating a long drive to just get to the kit and then to the deployment sites. Now, selection was run by my troop, and then we divided successful soldiers between 5 and 3-2, which I always felt 3-2 thought was perhaps biased, although frankly it was not. Add to that the fact that everything was duplicated in both troops, such as the troop quartermaster stores, and critically, all the daily continuation training. It just made so much more sense to join as a battery, harmonize the doctrine, the operational readiness, and actually be based near the deployment area. I spoke to both CO of 5 and 3-2 regiments about this, but they would just not entertain the idea. And I think they feared losing some of their best sportsmen, particularly I remember the rugby and boxing guys. As naturally, one regiment would then take the battery under command and inherit the other troop. In other words, one of them would lose out.
It's amazing how sporting prowess affects an operational decision.
That's Jones's theory. In early 89, a new Commander General support arrived called Colonel Kit Faith, and he came to 5 Regiment for a troop brief by me, with Patrol Commander Sergeant Mark Thigpen and Bombardier Mark Martin also present, and we went actually inside the demonstration mexi that we had dug in camp. I explained down there how we had all this replicated training and administrative duplication, and how we could be a battery in the original location of the first troop in Hildesheim, actually in the area of operations. Now, he loved the idea, and clearly after high-level Royal Artillery consultations, both COs were informed we would be forming a Special OP battery in 5 Regiment, but sadly staying in Dortmund. But at least the main aim was achieved. I became the first battery captain, and my posting was extended for a few months at the end of 89 to put it together. And the rest is history. The actual name bounced around a bit, though. CO5 wanted H battery reformed as another letter battery to match the others in the regiment. Now, there were a lot of RHA sort of views on that as well, and I won't get into that with letters versus number batteries.
And maybe just worth explaining, we've got a couple of non-military listeners, David, so just getting a little bit geeky here. Can you just maybe explain why letters and numbers matter to different regiments?
Yeah, I think I'm correct. All Royal Horse Artillery regiments have letter batteries. And virtually all of the field regiments, as in not the Royal Horse Artillery, but just the Royal Artillery, had numbered batteries. But 5 Regiment had P, K, Q, and HQ, but was not an RHA regiment. And again, this is just Jones's theory, but H battery was not reformed. There was a rumor that the CO knew it had more silver and it would grace the regiment's tables better. But we were informed it would be 7.3 Sphinx battery, and then it became 4.73 Sphinx for reasons unknown to me.
I think that was mainly just to save the number of another battery that probably was going to go into suspended animation.
Possibly, yes, you might be right. It was during the time when we lost a lot of regiments and units. I went down to 3-2 Regiment during the formation process to sort out the secret paperwork in their secure room. and bring anything relevant back to 5 Regiment. Most of it, of course, was duplication, the reason why we came together as a battery, but written on the letter to both COs directing the formation of the battery and its creation in 5 Regiment, the CO of 3-2, Barry Fairman, a wonderful character, had written, "That is Jones off the Christmas card list," which amused me.
I know Barry Fairman well. Was fortunate enough to
okay.
serve under him as CO when he took us to Northern Ireland. An absolutely outstanding commanding officer, a real character. And he was later honorary colonel of 3-2 Regiment when I was there as well. Yeah. So he's an absolute character. I could tell a few stories about him.
Absolutely.
So for the historical junkies out there, 7-3 Battery was formed in 1990 and became 473 Battery 2 years later. And one of our listeners asked if there's any animosity or rivalries when the two troops came together, and this was definitely not the case. As David pointed out earlier, most of the troop members socialised together regardless of regiment and troop. In addition, we saw it as strength in numbers and good for survival, so we're all very, very keen to become a fully fledged subunit. What I do remember, though, is that when we came a battery, the CO5 Reg wanted a formation parade, which any decent patrol soldier was horrified by. And a Guards sergeant, I don't remember which battalion he was from, Coldstream or Scots, whatever, but he turned up one day and he was drafted in to try and get us ready. And we almost reduced the poor sod to tears because such was our ineptitude. And in fact, our ineptitude was only surpassed by a complete lack of effort. And he tried to march us down to the hairdressers to get a load of haircuts, and he was sort of faced by a mutiny. So we did manage to get through a formation parade, but it did not look pretty at all. Were you there for that, David, or had you left at that point?
No, I left. That was after the Gulf, wasn't it? I'd left.
Oh, yeah, it would have been, yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I got posted before the Gulf. My next position as an adjutant was already vacant for the months that I stayed to help put the battery together.
All right, got you. So, as usual, we're going to finish off with Desert Island Dits, which is the guest pick of favourite military book, film, and luxury items. So, David, what are your choices?
The book is, I'm going to cheat, it's a 2-part series, both very detailed and large, but truly excellent accounts of Canadian soldiers in World War I. It's by Tim Cook, who I believe is the curator of the Canadian Military Museum. Volume 1 is called At the Sharp End, Canadians Fighting the Great War, 1914 to 1916. And the second volume is called Shock Troops, Canadians Fighting the Great War, 1917 to 1919. Absolutely brilliant. They were fighting as Dominion troops under the British at the time. I highly commend it to anybody. If I would be allowed a fiction choice, there's a World War I theme here too, but it's a truly Canadian book. It would be 3-Day Road by Joseph Boyden.
And what's 3-Day Road about?
It's about 2 natives who join up. They take 3 days to canoe down to the nearest recruiting station, and they join up, and they both become snipers. And it's a tale of how one of them becomes addicted to the amphetamines or whatever they were being given at the time. Morphine. It was morphine. And how the other one is his partner, but gets worried. And then I won't spoil the story, but it's beautifully told by the returning guy. Is
it based on any sort of fact at all, or is it all completely fictionalized?
I think it's vaguely based on just some of the detail fact of what life in the trenches and what working as a sniper was like. But it's the guy's first book. It's quite breathtaking. Really good. Really good.
When was it written?
I'm not sure, but I think probably only a few years ago.
Oh, okay. What I find remarkable about the Canadians, both in the First and Second World War, was that there was no conscription, from my understanding. And certainly I know that was the case in the Second World War, but they were all volunteers.
Yeah, and a very big divide between the French Canadians and the English Canadians, because there was a perception that they were fighting England's war, but right. But that might have been politicized over the years. It may not be that true, but yes.
Yeah, and I know Dieppe left a bit of a scar on the Canadians as well, didn't it? Because I think they took the brunt of the casualties at Dieppe. But
yeah, absolutely.
But if it hadn't been for Dieppe and the lessons learned at Dieppe, the D-Day landings probably wouldn't have gone as well as they did.
Yeah, correct.
So film?
Film would be Das Boot, which is the unbelievable tension in a hunted submarine. It's quite frightening. Yeah, brilliant. I'll have to watch it again.
Yeah, they've just remade that on Sky as a series.
Ah,
But I haven't seen it. But I totally agree with you. Das Boot is unbelievably good, and it's one of those services of the war with the Germans. Das Boot is probably the only book and film that's well known about. And I was reading a sort of a revisionist take on Germany's ambitions in the war, and they're saying that rather than concentrate on capital ships that impressed the world, they should have concentrated more on the U-boat fleet, because they had all these capital ships like the Bismarck, but they had no real ports for them to go to and service them and look after them. And there was a lot of money wasted on that, whereas if they concentrated on the U-boat fleet, there'd been a far more effective use of resources.
yeah, I think you're probably right there, yes.
So, luxury item?
Anyone who knows me knows it would have to be wine. Now, having listened to Sammy's podcast, if we're on the same island, I'll swap him some of my wine for some of his cigar.
And there's a definite trend here, David, of the troop lads. Pete Walsh is taking cherry brandy, so it's going to be a bit of a piss up in this island if everybody's marooned at the same time.
Would be great.
So my recommendation this week is a book called Unreasonable Behaviour by the photographer Don McCullin. And Don McCullin was one of those generations of war photographers that sprung up through the 60s and 70s who, I mean, you just don't see war photography in any shape or form now, in my eyes, because post-Vietnam, people like Don McCullin probably helped this, because post-Vietnam, the film and the photos of Vietnam probably helped lose that war, because it got home to the American people, the suffering that the troops are going under. And you certainly see in places like the Falklands where the press were heavily controlled and had to be accredited, and all the output was severely constrained. I suppose it's getting a little bit easier nowadays because you've got things like camera phones and social media, and there's instant communications. But Don McCullin's amazing. He started off, when he left the RAF, he took some photographs on bomb sites of local gangs, and he sent them to the Times, and he got them published in the Times. And from there, he just started going to war zones, and he went to places like Cyprus in the early 60s when there was the British were fighting the Ioka terrorists, went across to Cambodia and Vietnam. And not only does he capture photographs in Vietnam and these conflict zones, he also has shot some excellent photography in the north of England, especially in the 60s and 70s, where he captured a lot of the poverty that was prevalent in those areas. And there was a brilliant documentary about him last year where he went to Syria, to Palma and places like that. The guy's about 80 years old and he's still going around taking photographs. It was very, very moving. So I definitely recommend Unreasonable Behaviour if anybody has not had a chance to look at that. So thanks to David and to the listeners for your support and suggestions, and please keep them coming in. And as usual, our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. On our next pod, our guest is Neil Hogg, and on it we'll cover Op Banna, which was a name given to the British Army's longest ever campaign in Northern Ireland. And we'll talk about pre-deployment training and what it was like on an operational tour of Londonderry in the late 1980s. JD, as he's known, will discuss the contact on that tour that killed two special observers, Steve Cummins and Miles Amos, and his subsequent struggles with PTSD, of which little was known about back then. And about a year and a half ago, we had a bit of a 473 battery reunion down in Salisbury, and I met up with JD and we were having a couple of drinks at the bar. And one of the reasons I'm so keen to get him on the podcast is he told me the treatment he received back then, which is almost criminal. The attitudes from senior medical officers and just generally, it's absolutely appalling. So that's one of the reasons I'm keen to get JD on that. So looking forward to future episodes then. On Pod 8, we're going to have a little Christmas book special with our guest Simon Vincent. I think you'll know Vinny quite well, David.
Oh, yes.
And each of us... Say again, sorry?
An outstanding soldier.
Yeah, absolutely. So living in New Zealand now. We're spread to the four winds. You're calling in from Beirut and Vinny's out in New Zealand.
Yeah, I can't tell you how proud I was when he came top of the Bombardier Leadership course at 1 RHA.
Especially for being the scruffiest git in the world.
And being they told the CO, no, it has to be him because there's no one from 1RHA who we can legitimately say is better. Because they were, it was brilliant.
As MD knows, Vinny, outstanding field soldier, scruffiest man in camp alive. So on that podcast, Vinny will pick his top 5 favourite books, and me and Kev will pick our top 5 as well. And on Pod 9, our guest is Jimmy Moram, who's a former chief instructor with the battery, and he'll discuss his deployment on Op Corporate during the Falklands War with the Parachute Regiment and the changes he made to selection in order to improve the content and the structure. I'm looking forward to Pod 10. We'll feature Chris Lincoln-Jones, who was BC when the battery deployed in Op Granby during the First Gulf War, and we'll discuss deployment and operations and what it meant for the battery at the time. So thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing support and sponsorship to this series and offering technical support through his company ISAR. And so we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.